Hi, good evening, everyone. Welcome. Welcome to the Center for Brooklyn History. My name is Marcia Eli. I get to greet you on behalf of my colleagues here at the Center and the Brooklyn Public Library, which we are part of, and the Arts and Culture team, BPL Presents. Thank you. I'm just very curious, how many people have not been to a program here at the Center for Brooklyn History before? If this is your first one, okay, well, thank you for coming, and I hope that this is not just the first, but the first and last, but that you'll come to many others. We are a place of scholarship and research. We steward the largest collection of Brooklyn-related materials in the world. Right above us is a magnificent reading room where researchers come every day to explore our collections. And we, of course, have education programs of all kinds and free public programs like this one every week. So tonight's program looks at a history that has long been overlooked. That is the history of Native American enslavement in this country. Scholars estimate that there were between 2.5 and 5 million Native Americans enslaved here between 1492 and the late 19th century, an astonishing number. Tonight, we're honored to welcome two people who've traveled to Brooklyn all the way from Rhode Island to tell us about this all but unknown history and about a digital project that brings that history into the light of day. The name of the project is Stolen Relations, and as the project website says, these are hard realities and difficult histories, but they need to be told fully so we can start to be more honest about the history of this country and think more clearly about how to make amends moving forward. So following their presentation and discussion, we'll have some time to take questions from all of you. Our ushers will come and bring you a microphone where you're sitting. Please help us by standing when you speak and keeping your questions as short as possible. Now it's my pleasure to tell you a little bit about our distinguished guests and welcome them to the stage. Linford D. Fisher is an associate professor of history at Brown University. Among other books, he is the author of The Indian Great Awakening, Religion, and the Shaping of Native Cultures in Early America, as well as numerous articles and chapters. Professor Fisher is the principal investigator of the digital project titled Stolen Relations, Recovering Stories of Indigenous Enslavement in the Americas, which is a community-centered, tribal collaborative project that seeks to broaden our understanding of Indigenous experiences of settler colonialism and its legacies through the lens of slavery and servitude. He's just finished a book called Stealing America, The Hidden Story of Indigenous Slavery in U.S. History, which will be out in April 2026. And I invite you to come back to talk about that. And all of you. Lorén M. Spears, enrolled Narragansett Tribal Nation citizen and executive director of the Tamaqua Museum, holds multiple honorary doctorate degrees, is an author and artist, and has contributed to a wide array of publications, including Downland Voices, an anthology of indigenous writing of New England, and From Slaves to Soldiers, the First Rhode Island Regiment in the American Revolution. Under her leadership, Tamaqua Museum received the Institute of Museums and Library Services, the IMLS's National Medal in 2016. She is the recipient of numerous awards and honors and a founding member of the Tribal Advisory Board for the Stolen Relations Project. I am so happy that you're both here to bring this history here to Brooklyn. Please, thank you. Please help me welcome Professor Fisher and Lorén.
Good evening, everyone. Really nice to be here. Thanks so much to Marcia and Eli for the invitation to be here. Can you hear me okay? It sounds very quiet. It's lovely to be down here, and I'm pleased to share the stage with a collaborator for this project as well. My name is Linford Fisher, as you heard, I teach at Brown University.
Spears. Askui Kwasin, Natasuis Makasini Pashao at Nahayagansik, Natasuis Lorén Spears at Englisha Ni Nahayagansik Nahantik. Kanupiam, welcome.
So we'll be tag teaming a little bit tonight, just to keep you on your edge of your seats a little bit, keep you honest here. But we are here to talk about this digital project and also the history of Native American enslavement. So we'll be doing a little bit of both, talking about the project, introducing it, doing a little bit of a tour of the website, but then using documents to discuss the history as it plays out over time as well. Without further ado, I also want to mention the two books that Marcia mentioned here. We have QR codes if you want to hunt them down, or you can just take down the names and titles, or not at all if you want as well. But just to say that we both are invested in traditional scholarship as well in terms of this history, in terms of these stories and ideas, and this website kind of meshes and merges with some of this prior work and current work that we're doing as well. Yes, thank you. And I don't know if it could be turned up at all as well. But so in terms of the project itself, as Marcia mentioned, this is a tribally collaborative database project that seeks to recover individual stories of Native American enslavement in American history. And it, at its core, is a website that contains a number of different things, which we'll show in just a little bit, a database, contemporary voices, some essays, some lesson plans. And it's deeply collaborative in nature. There's about 12 to 13 different New England Native nations and communities involved in this process that's been going on for about 10 years. The past 6 years have been more intensely collaborative. It's based in the Center for Digital Scholarship at Brown. There's a large team of staff members working with us, the Brown Library. There's an academic advisory board. We have a bunch of research assistants and volunteers, and I would just put the plug out there. If this, what you see tonight, in the next 45, 50 minutes interests you and you want to get involved, we definitely have means to incorporate volunteers into our research process as well. So I do put that out there. Also, a lot of high school students have been helping out. So if you know of any bright young high schoolers who want to jump in, let me know. And also diverse funding streams, including the NEH, although that was unfortunately terminated early, as we all know. So what are some of the core values and aims before we jump into the website itself? First of all, I think we are really trying to just understand this history. As Marcia mentions, I imagine if we kind of canvass the room and ask each person to raise their hand about how much they know about Native American slavery and American history, it might not be such a large number who could talk a lot about it, right? This isn't a history we're often taught in schools or textbooks, but it really was a quite large sort of series of events and phenomenon over the course of almost 500 years. So it involves, the numbers are kind of, fungible, but 2.5 to 5 or 3 to 6 million Native people were enslaved between 1492, the coming of Columbus, and 1880, in the 1880s when slavery in the Western Hemisphere was finally eradicated. But it even continues on beyond that in different kinds of forms, as we'll say. More than 500,000 Native people were enslaved in what is now the United States and North America. It's involved in every single English colony and American state over time as well. And it's really connected to other kinds of processes that I think are important. So it helps us understand also how indigenous people lost their lands. So when you enslave people who are on land that you want to take, that makes it easier to sort of eventually take their lands when you remove people from it. So again, at the core of understanding this is this database of 7,000 people and growing that we have along with other resources.
So one of the things that we really wanted to do, the Native Advisory, along with Linford Fisher here, is to really center Native voices and Native perspectives in this database. to create a resource that serves Native communities and has Native perspectives on our history. Give opportunities for the Native community for internships, staff positions, funding collaborations, and most importantly, decolonize or indigenize the archive. And one of the things that we thought about as Native advisory communities members is how could this go from being a database as solely a scholarly instrument to something that was impactful for our communities to forge for healing. And so some of that was the name. Stolen relations was a terminology that came out of that advisory committee discussions. And we thought the database of indigenous slaveries in the Americas was too clinical and not really getting to where we wanted to be. We also, you saw two beautiful pieces of art at the beginning of the first couple of slides. It was incorporating through art also that Native perspective of what that loss is and giving lots of opportunity for Native people to intersect. There were elders that were doing summer programs. I don't remember what you called those summer institutes. And then there were young people participating in those. There were internships. There's students that were students at Brown, but as you heard, high school and college students from other places that were participating in this. And most importantly, we really wanted to spend some time decolonizing the approach of the archive of this information. We know that this information is isolated and often little fragments of information, little news articles, little pieces of information, and we wanted that information to be told in different ways. So when we get a little farther in this, we'll show you some of the ways that we decolonized the database and gave decolonizing language, gave new word choices, gave life to spaces that didn't have any through storytelling and oral history, photography, and art forms of various sorts to kind of round out the story. Because when people are stolen and enslaved, they're erased from their own stories. Their stories are minimized to single words like Indian boy. That doesn't tell you your name, doesn't tell you what village and family you're from, doesn't tell you what nation you belong to, doesn't tell anything about your relationship with the land in your community. And so we wanted to reanimate that information as best we could while still being able to have a scholarly database that is helpful for scholars, but also helpful for the community. We wanted the Native community to want to interact with this database, and also the general public at large to want to interact with it and to think about things differently by being prompted through those decolonizing notes to think about something in a different way. Here we go. So here's another example of one of the art pieces that happens to be art by my sister-in-law, Dawn Spears, Reconnection. She's a very talented Narragansett artist and has done her art all across the country and beyond. So the Stolen Relations core values and aims are to point visitors and users to the present. We want people to know that we're still here, that Indigenous people are not just of the past, haven't just vanished with the dinosaurs that people kind of lump us in with sometimes. We want people to know that we're here, we're vibrant communities, we're empowered and impactful on this country, but also empowered in our own culture and communities. And we wanted to make sure that there was reciprocity so that this database didn't just sit in isolation, but would point to tribal community websites, tribal organization websites, and share that other information in other ways, and also allow the audience to know how they could engage with the Native community. We also wanted it to represent our resilience and survivance and perseverance and steadfastness of our ancestors that ensured that we're still here, and wanted people to know that we're still, representing our cultures and communities, and this could also act as a celebration of that through the art, through the storytelling, through this work of healing, through reconciling this history. It's really difficult for communities to deal with the trauma of enslavement in general, but then to have that history actually erased makes it even harder for people to start to heal and unpack that trauma. There are people in tribal communities that will say there was no enslavement because it's so hurtful to think about the pain of that, but also because it wasn't universal. So I'm a Narragansett tribal citizen, and some of our ancestors were enslaved, not all. And that makes it complicated and complex in the history, but it's still impactful on our people today. In one of the presentations I do on enslavement, I start listing our surnames in our community today: Brown, Babcock, Stanton, Thomas, and Wilcox, and Hazard. And if you look back at the historical record of the colonial landowners, they all have those same last names. And it's hard to acknowledge that. But it's one of those things that we have to do in order to start the healing process. You can't heal if you don't acknowledge where the pain comes from. You can't not only heal but thrive in the 21st century if you don't acknowledge where your hurts come from and start unpacking them, and then also finding ways to reconcile them in a way that can allow you to, like, we have a word that we use a lot now, which is thrivance. Not just survive, but not just thrive, but kind of a combination of those, that our ancestors had to do that survival mode, but when do we stop surviving and start thriving? And so we want to get those two things to come together so that our people can do that. And I feel like Dawn's artwork here on reconnection and showing that cyclical nature of history is creating that understanding and that survivance, and then eventually that thrivance that shows that we're still here in the 21st century and still connected to our families and communities and understanding our cultural knowledges and willing to work with people like Lynn to show it in a different way in an academic setting.
The final thing we wanted to mention here is just the desire that came up really early in our conversations with tribal partners about creating a resource that could be used for educational context as well. It's actually quite challenging to put together a good curriculum on this difficult history. We have 2 units of 5 already either drafted or completed that are on the website, and this is just one example that can hopefully reframe some of the conversations about slavery, not to displace at all the centrality importance of Black and African slavery in American history, but to show that there's these other layers that kind of are interwoven and happening at the same time throughout this history. So hopefully this curriculum, which ties into the AP US History curriculum and other kinds of standards for US history, will be useful.
And I'll just add a little bit to that. I think this is where the advisory committee was really helpful too in editing and contributing to the curriculum, and the importance of creating resources for teachers. You know, when something's erased, usually it's erased in a way that teachers and people that are well-meaning would love to put it in there, but they don't have the resources in which to do so in any kind of way. So I really commend not only Lynn, but even the other curriculum that we did with the Center for Slavery and Justice at Brown, which is providing these resources for teachers to be able to move this narrative forward in a way that is meaningful, appropriate for the grade levels, and truthful in the full breadth of the history.
So we want to do just a really quick website demo, and we will get to the actual history in a minute using some of these sources. But let me just show just for a little bit what the site looks like and what it's about. So I would say it's not really just for scholars. It's meant for the wider public. There's a wide variety of resources on here. If you come to the landing page, you'll see several different ways to interact with it. So one of the things that we did is we began to write stories that come out of individual records from the archives to sort of bring people to life a little more. The challenging thing about slavery records is they often strip away a lot of identifying information about people and sort of isolate them from communities and families. But when we could, we tried to reconstruct some of these histories. You can search the database directly. I'll show you that in a second. There's a map here. I'll show these other things in just a minute too, and then Lorén will talk about Indigenous voices. The core of it is this Explore page, which gives you some of these same options, the people, timeline, map, Indigenous voices. And this is a search bar that you can just use sort of straight up. You could say New York, and then it automatically populates all of the different options down below. Once you click on an individual card, you get to a little summary of that person along with the document itself. If we have the actual document, a physical copy or a photograph of it, that'll be here as well. And then you can see as much as you want, a lot more information. Sometimes there's relationships that can connect people across different documents, and then also different sort of technical information too. On the sidebar, you have different ways to cite it. If you see a problem or have additions, I would just highlight that as well. If you see something on here that you're like, I know something about that person, let us know. We want to add it. And also, you know, Lorén will talk more about decolonizing the archive, but just trying to understand the steps we've taken to not repeat the harms of the archive through the documents that we show, if that makes sense. There's also a glossary. But so there's a lot you can do with this interface. The filters menu is pretty robust as well. Again, I won't get into a lot of detail, but if you wanted to look at New York, for example, you could click on the 374 records that we have for New York, and if you just, well, my mouse is gone. I'm not sure why that's the case. There we go. It disappears right around there. I'm not sure why that's the case. And I can't click on the X, unfortunately. You ever heard the story about the danger of live presentations of websites? Yeah, this is it right here. I have no idea what's going on. Anyway, but if you click on that, and I'll try one more time, but I'm not sure what's going on. Yeah, okay. So down here, then we do all the New York ones. Yeah, so you can see we also are including enslavers in this, not just enslaved people, because we were told by the Tribal Advisory Board early on that that's actually one of the main ways to trace family lineages is through the enslavers. And so even though it's kind of strange to have them show up, they are in here as well, because it creates that bigger picture and context. So that's the search interface. We also have a long timeline for those who might not be familiar with any of this history as it intersects with Native enslavement. It's probably too long to read all in one sitting, but at least you can take a look at this. But I would point out too that we come up into the 21st century because we think these histories are all connected in different kinds of ways as well. And then there's also, if you're a visual person, we have a map that helps you to understand what this looks like in the bigger picture, and you can see there's records all over the place in the Atlantic, in Central America, even South America. If you zoom in to New York, which, let's see if I can do this smoothly, and click over here in Manhattan, for example, I went a little bit closer than I wanted to. You have all these different dots. Each one represents a person that you could open up and click on and then click through to the record, which is helpful. So I'm going to let Lorén talk about the Indigenous voices for a second.
So Along with what Lynn was just saying about the database and the way that you can interface with it, from the map, from putting in your own information, from the timeline. And I do say the timeline is really interesting. We worked a lot on that because we wanted to be able to share different things. Why is this not moving up? Oh, there we go. Thank you. I was being a little bit dyslexic just then. We also wanted to not only indigenize the website through the language choice. If you notice, we say things like unfree and enslaved and sort of decolonize some of those language choices. But we also wanted to animate the website. And this was a lot of conversation. I will say, not Lynn so much, but maybe some of the very straight academic folks really were like, what are you doing? And why are you doing it? And we really thought it was important. So you'll notice I'm here, but there's other people. Well, I'm having a tech. I guess I need to put my glasses on because I can't see. Okay. And so there are different people, a sampling this way. I'm having a struggle here. Okay, there we go. Sorry. I'm like doing the opposite of what needs to be done with my fingers. So you'll see I'm actually here a couple of times doing different sections. What I wanted to do was slide it over. Do you just use this right here? There we go. And you can see there's different segments of me speaking and talking around this. But it also has people from Mashpee, Paula Peters doing the same thing, sharing these different perspectives on Indigenous slavery. Patricia Rocker, who's Chappaquiddick Wampanoag, and it continues to go down into art that's included. Dawn Spears that we mentioned, but there's also Malia Scott, who's a youth. I don't know, she's like a tween, maybe 13, something like that did that piece. And then Great Swamp Massacre by Tall Oak Whedon, which we're going to talk more about that in a minute, about how the wars in the colonial times led to a lot of enslavement. Am I having... And then you see, I'll click on one of these images here. That's the cover page image that you see. And then we have Dawn Spears here. It says Lost But Not Forgotten. And it shows her really creative artwork that she does in her particular style. And then it tells about the painting so that you can understand that. And what's really important is it takes you into today with missing and murdered Indigenous women, girls, LGBTQ folks, et cetera, which is really important because whether we like it or not, people that are being stolen today, and we might call it trafficked, it might hide the enslavement that's happening to people. Along with that, there's other ways that you can look at this at the bottom here and see all the people and all the conversations that take place. We were going to show you, if I can get back to it, just do this one again. It's really easier than you think. I don't know why I'm having a difficulty. It's like being weird. It's like... There we go. I wanted to just put the intro of one of the films. Oh, NG, I keep doing this wrong. Why is your computer different than mine? There we go. All right.
Yo way, yo way, yo way na, way na, way na, way na, ayana way.
Asui Kwasin. So we won't make you listen to me on screen, but I wanted you to see the intro. We had Native artists, musicians that are, were brought in to collaborate, but just to bring that voice and that music and the voices of different Indigenous people through this portion. Oh, because that was an add-on page. Okay. Let's see. There's sections in here also about teaching about Indigenous slavery, the glossary of terms, and then I wanted to, can we go back to the section with one of the, I just wanted to show one of the decolonizing button pages. Like on the, yes, thank you. So if you look at this one, that says Marat, an unfree young man who was in Prince's Court in Westminster, England. If you also go over here, you can go to the Decolonizing the Archive and read the decolonizing statement. Not that I'm going to make you do that right this second, but one of the things that we really wanted to think about was the phrases and the filters that you could look through. One of the things was names. Well, a lot of times they left the names off, or it was the anglicized name or a new name altogether. If we could, we would restore the Indigenous name as possible. Gender, we were also concerned about because at the time they were only going to give you male and female gender norms, and it didn't acknowledge two-spirited people. Tribal nations, we thought that was important, even though they were erased sometimes. We wanted people to acknowledge that they had a tribal nation, even if that wasn't included. We also were concerned about the racial descriptors. There were words like musty that were used, other kinds of words that erased identity, and there was a lot of erasure of Indigenous identity in the record. I mean, in the book that I worked on, From Slaves to Soldiers in the 1st Rhode Island Regiment, someone would go into the war, into military service as Narragansett, and he'd come out as colored, black, musty, or some other term like that. And I think that that's something important for people to think about. And so we were trying to make people focus in and be aware of it and not just erase the indigeneity. We also were talking about the locations and how the names were also superimposed, and sometimes they were the colonial names of locations, and certainly erasure of the places and people that are there. So I don't know if there was anything else you wanted me to share there, but if not, we'll grab it.
I think it's good. I'll just very quickly kind of, I mean, this is live, you can see it, it's stoldenrelations.org, but there's an educate page that we hope is helpful for educators, resources for different kinds of grades. There's other websites that might be interesting for people that are sort of slavery or related to the topics. There's a list of tribal partners, very importantly, that show who we're collaborating with. And then if you really want to dive in and get into the nitty-gritty, if you're a programmer or into the digital humanities, there's certain kinds of information here that's really helpful as well. So I think that's really it. We're happy to take questions at the end about the project. We can pull it up again. But we did want to move into some of the actual history too, because we think that that could be helpful just to think about that through these documents. So there's a lot of them. We'll try to move quickly, but not too quickly, just to give you a sense of this. Okay, sorry, to really eat it. So one of the things we hope comes out of this is that we can tell stories from the archives about this history, about Native enslavement and servitude in American history. And part of the reason why this history isn't really well known is the stories and the archival documents are tucked away in hard to reach places, and they're not always sort of done and kept track of in the same way as sort of the African slave trade, for example, or black slavery. So it's a really disparate kind of history. So this is hoping, we're trying to collect this all in one place. So where do we start? Well, we start in 1492 with Columbus. So we just had Indigenous Peoples Day or Columbus Day, depending on where you live, I guess. But there's a reason why a lot of cities and states have moved to call it Indigenous Peoples Day, because without meaning to cause any offense to the Italian American community, Columbus was really the one who inaugurated this long history. So he personally trafficked hundreds of natives back to Spain, not just for display, but also a sale into slavery. He proposed a regular native slave trade, and the Spanish enslaved thousands of indigenous people in the Caribbean as well. So this is actually coming from a secondary source, but there are many, many examples of individuals who are adjacent to Columbus and the Spanish in the early 16th century that illustrate this kind of history. But it wasn't just the Spanish, and that's really one of the main points of the history we're trying to highlight, is that it's an English and American story too. So really the database, in a way, in terms of the chronology, starts with the Spanish period, but then moves up to English colonialism and eventually the United States. So here's an example in New England before Plymouth is founded. Plymouth is founded in 1620, but even before the Puritans and the Pilgrims came, there were English merchants off the coast of New England who were occasionally capturing natives either as trophy pieces or for sale into slavery. So this is one example. Captain Thomas Hunt captured 24 Wampanoag off the coast of Cape Cod in 1614, including the famous Squanto or Tisquantum. Sometimes we wonder if you remember as a school child hearing about Squanto greeting the Pilgrims in English in 1620, right? How did he know English? Well, he had been taken as a captive and attempted to be enslaved in Spain, and then escaped and went to England and came back to North America. So this is just one example of that as well. So we want to do a little bit of sort of answering the question, how were natives enslaved in English and American colonies and states? And then we just want to highlight some recurring patterns that we hope will help illustrate this history through these documents. So one of them is wars against native peoples.
So, of course, we're going to think about the Pequot War from 1637, which was one of the first wars in the conquest of this place we now call New England. The Pequot War, there was over 80 Pequot women and children sent to Boston and sold into slavery. More than 200 were enslaved in total, and these are numbers we can prove as opposed to what really happens in war, including the wife of Mananoto, who was sold to the governor, John Winthrop. And this is an example of in the database where it speaks to his wife and how she had a very modest countenance and behavior. And it was because of that she was, because she had helped 2 English maids be spared from death, she was also kind of taken care of a little bit better than other indigenous slaves. And so I think that that's important. You see here, this is one of the decolonizing terminologies, the name once known. When someone doesn't have the name that they were born with or any name that they're given, they just talk to her as the spouse of. And I think that we started using that term, name once known versus unknown. It wasn't unknown, it just was once known. And so that's really important. I think that when you think about the Pequot War and the complicated time that was happening here in this region, it speaks to the first phase of land dispossession by removal of people from the land and removal by many means, death, as well as enslavement, as well as just forced diaspora to other spaces and places. You can't speak to native enslavement without thinking about the War for New England, which is known by most people as King Philip's War, and we decolonize that to the War for New England because really the ultimate goal, again, was dispossession from the land in order to create this new place called New England. And in this record, it shows Robin as an unfree person described as Indian, in quotes, and who was in Tangier, Morocco in 1676. This is a list of slaves belonging to His Majesty Bagnia of Tangier. And it shows the inventory. There's a little square that shows the Indian names that are there. And so this is really like something that was happening all the time. And interesting is not the right word. The difficulty of it is we weren't always documented. We were erased right from the record and used as non-human sometimes in the record, or just not put there at all. So I think that when we're talking about recovering these stories of Indigenous enslavement in the Americas, it's to try to bring these stories to life and to bring these people to life. And as we go along, you'll see that there's some that start to get a thread. And that's when the students, if you get a chance to come in here and read some of the writings that the students have done and some of the faculty and other researchers and participants, they're weaving together all these little pieces and finding a full story. So some people will know a lot about, and some people we won't know very much at all. But by having this database, we're starting to weave together the stories and be able to tell a more full story, not only of these individual people, but of the enslavement of Indigenous peoples in the Americas. And so I think that we have to also know that they were enslaving people here in quote unquote America, the colonies, the states, but also taking people to the Caribbean, to Bermuda, to other islands in the Caribbean in which we're enslaved. I do want to say that we've been part of, it's probably going on close to 30, maybe 5 years ago since it started, was a reconnection between the Indigenous people here on the mainland to the Indigenous people on the islands of the archipelago of Bermuda. And Talok, who I mentioned earlier with one of his art pieces in this, was one of the people that initiated that work and connection. And it's the idea of reconnecting the generations that are coming down and reconnecting those that have been displaced. And it really is a beautiful thing because there have been really strong relationships that have been made over the last 30 plus years. Some of the people that are in their 30s, that's all they've known is this interrelationship between those that were stolen from us and those that we now have relationship with again of Indigenous peoples on St. David's Island and Bermuda in the archipelago. Did you want to add more to that?
Yeah, so this is actually another example of maybe the opposite direction. So if the wars in North America ended up resulting in colonists shipping natives out into the Caribbean, there was also the opposite happening too, which is that you had English merchants and privateers in the Caribbean who would steal native people from Central and South America or from ships, Spanish and Portuguese ships, and then bring them back to North America to sell them into slavery too. One example here is Increase Mather, who is a Boston Puritan minister, eventually one of the presidents of Harvard, and his son actually gifts, his son Cotton Mather, who's also a famous Puritan minister, gifts his father, Increase Mather, enslaved Spanish Indian woman. Which just shows you how commonplace this was in 1681, that nobody batted an eye, but also has kind of been invisibilized in terms of the history of slavery. And this is just, this Spanish Indian girl is just one of thousands that are being trafficked from the Caribbean to Bermuda, to Virginia, to New England, to Philadelphia, to New York, in a way that I think is something we're trying to piece together as well. One of the most surprising pieces of this history is actually the presence of large-scale native slave trades that we really don't factor into our histories of slavery really at all. There's two major ones I want to mention. These are the two biggest ones in English colonies. The first is the Carolina native slave trade, ran for about 40 years or so, 1680 to 1720. And one scholar, Alan Gillay, who wrote this book called The Indian Slave Trade, if you want to look it up, he estimates between 25,000 and 51,000 natives were enslaved from the Carolinas and shipped out into the Caribbean, but also to New York, to Philadelphia, to Boston, to Rhode Island as well. So much so that eventually laws were passed against their arrival. Yeah.
I just want to add in, you're talking about indigenous people from the Carolinas being enslaved and taken away. It's back to the land, right? Because then if they weren't taken away in enslavement, they were forced marched to Oklahoma territory in the Trail of Tears. And I think that people have to realize those are all like connected to each other and they're not singular. They're just what strategy gets them off the land. You can kill them, you can enslave them, you can force them to some other place, and then that the land becomes free for you to have.
A really important point. And so the second one is from the Mosquito Shore, which is present-day Nicaragua and Honduras in Central America. And there was a huge slave trade out of there. People who observed this compared this to what was happening in Africa, where you had coastal natives who would actually raid to the interior, bring out enslaved people to sell to English merchants who would then ship them elsewhere. And the record we have here to show you is an example of a Carolina Indian woman being sold in Boston by Captain James Grant in 1712. And there's a lot of records like this in the newspapers at this time period.
So you were getting enslaved from a lot of different reasons. One, certainly just disrupting culture and community and removing people from things, as we were just discussing. But there was also this idea of punishment, debt, and indenture as a type of enslavement through the courts. And what I find particularly maybe egregious in this is that they were creating the laws that would create the debt to create the punishment and indenture. So if you're an indigenous person living on your own land, and then they come in and they say there's a new law in which we're going to give the land to the eldest male in your family, and they're going to own it as we own things in a Eurocentric way. A year goes by, you've still just living on your land the way you always have, but then they come back and go, oh, but you are now in this process and there's taxation. And so you now owe this money, and if you can't pay it, then there's a punishment. There were other ways that people were put into debt as well. They were also, breaking laws that were put into place, whether that was, drunkenness or disorderly conduct or other kinds of things like that, that would give you a punishment, and then there would be a fine, and then there'd be a debt that you couldn't pay, and then you would be indentured to pay off that debt. There were people that were pushed from town to town where they were sort of warned out of the town and then considered the impoverished people that didn't have the resource to do that, and so they could be indentured or enslaved to pay back that debt. There were other different kinds of ways in which you could gain a debt. You could just owe someone something, and then that could accumulate. You could lose it in gambling, which also happened. I think of King Tom Ninigret and the amount of land he lost and became indebted because of the gambling, which is something that he learned when he went to England as a young child, a tween. I'm sure the alcoholism was joined by that, but those are certain kinds of enslavements that are happening. I also think that these kinds of things, there were laws on the books that are really shocking. And one of the ones that sticks with me the most, and maybe Lynn can tell a couple more after I finish this one, is that there were laws on the books that you couldn't harvest bark. And so if you were caught harvesting the bark, then you were either fined or imprisoned for it. I sort of liken it to sort of the school to jail pipeline that happens for certain communities of people today. It was they created the punishments that they knew you would break based on your normal life ways, and then they could just push you that way so that you would become indebted and get a punishment and become indentured or enslaved in order to pay it back.
And so the example we have of this is Samuel Barnabas, who he and his wife ran into debt of a certain colonist named James Lovell, and to pay off that debt, they had to serve him for 2 years. But during those 2 years, they were abused in different ways, and so had to, and then sort of complained about it. But just that idea that you would have to sort of suffer the indignity of kind of serving off time. So moving quickly here, wartime bounties is another sort of invisible thing that we sort of forget about. Every single colonial war, local governments would publish in newspapers a bounty call that says if you bring a captive back to Boston or back to wherever, you will get paid a certain amount of money, sometimes as much as like a year's salary. Like, it is a lot of money. Also offered money for scalps as well. And so this happens in the 17th century, even up through the American Revolution, in really interesting ways. And so here's just one example. In 1725, Captain Lovewell brings in an enslaved, a person that is captured, destined for slavery, and the person escapes before they can be sold. But there's examples of this. We also wanted to highlight some of the interesting sort of resistance and agency of Indigenous people too, which I think is really interesting. So one of them that we find a lot of is advertisements or notices in newspapers of enslaved natives or servants who have run away. And so here's just one example. An Indigenous person named Charles who ran away, is 23 years old in 1775, so just on the cusp of the American Civil War in, I think this is South Carolina, North Carolina. But what's interesting is these newspaper advertisements, even though they're written from enslavers' perspectives, give us more insight than we have about most enslaved people, because they list their clothing and the color, their hairstyle and any scars and stuff like that. And so they have to be read with a grain of salt, but it is kind of interesting to have these little tidbits about people through these advertisements, which exist in the hundreds and hundreds. There's examples of fighting back. So this is a New York story here, actually, in 1708. An enslaved native man named Sam, I think his name was, one night, middle of the night, snuck around from room to room and just murdered the entire enslaver family. And it so spooked the New York City residents. It's actually here on Long Island, or maybe not here. Did I just offend somebody by saying this is Long Island? On Long Island, and it so spooked New York magistrates they actually passed a law and specifically mentioned this incident, which is really fascinating. Of course, Sam and his wife were brutally tortured and killed for these actions. More positively, I guess, in a way, is suing for freedom, which happens over and over again. Surprisingly, maybe enslaved Indigenous people, as well as enslaved African people, use the courts to their favor and sue for their freedom. For Indigenous people, it's often claiming a maternal ancestor who was free. And if you think about it, every enslaved Native person at some point had a free maternal ancestor, right? So you find these court cases that go back multiple generations proving this ancestry. So this is an example from 1817 in Louisiana, a Supreme Court case sort of trying to prove the freedom of this enslaved Native named Seville. The process continues on just very quickly. So the story is not over with the Revolutionary War. The American period brings a surprising resurgence of Native enslavement that, again, if you're from the Southwestern California, you probably have some sense of this. But there's a lot of surprising hunting down of Native people all across the Southwest and in California. A repeat of kind of the East Coast clearing of Native people with removal, captive taking throughout between 1846, 1848, and after the end of the Civil War. Here's an example from California of a listing of forced indentures of Native children in California. There's a lot of records like this. Thousands and thousands of Native children were just indentured into white homes and worked on plantations that really mirrored Southern slavery, people often said. The 13th Amendment does not end this Western Native slavery and servitude, so Congress has to pass another law in 1867 that attempts to put down what was called peonage, but people at the time called functional slavery of indigenous people. It continues on even in different ways, which Lorén will talk about as well.
So we're thinking about, I mentioned the murdered and missing Indigenous women and girls. Well, thinking about the boarding school system, we always think of that as another form of forced slavery and forced labor. In the 1801 to 1970s, there was 410 federally funded boarding schools. But prior to that, there were boarding schools that were not federally funded. There were church schools, religious schools, and industrial schools that were all doing this work of removing Indigenous children from their families and communities and forcing them into this system. Carlisle, which is in Pennsylvania, is one of the most known Indigenous boarding schools where Pratt says, kill the Indian, save the man, is the quote to remove the indigeneity from these children. But they were forcibly taken. Most were forcibly taken from their families and homes. Most were forcibly, clothes changed, hairs cut, forced to speak English, forced to eat English-type foods, and to do jobs. They were being trained to do the jobs of the lowest echelon of society, to be domestics, to be, construction, masonry kinds of jobs, printers, and other kinds of things. A lot of physical labor-type jobs. And they would actually, in the summertime, the kids would not get to go home because they found when they sent the children home, they would disappear back into their communities and they couldn't get them back in the schools. So they started what they called outings. And these outings were really another form of forced labor. You stayed in a white home, you did a job at that home for free, and it was, your room and board, so to speak, and you were forced to be there. And some people were in these schools from as little as 2 or 3 years old. If you want to Google something, Google Haskell, Indian Nations University, and tiny handcuffs, and an article will come up from their 100th anniversary as a Native American boarding school that has now gone 360, not days in the year, but 360 degrees and 180 degrees, whatever, to be a school that Native kids want to go to for college. But they were reckoning with their history. And, I have a young grandson who's 7 now, and I remember looking at these handcuffs and thinking of him as a 4-year-old or 5-year-old and being forced to this school, so much so that they had to handcuff babies to the school. And many, many, many of these children died in these places. But they also used not only boarding schools to take our children away, but they used adoption and foster care as a way to remove children from Native communities. And all of these things were continuing until the Indian Child Welfare Act of 1978. And that's when, in the state that we live in Rhode Island, it was the same time period that the last industrial school was closed, where children were being taken from their families and communities. So it's very painful to me to think about this and to think about our ancestors and communities, but there's a lot of big institutions like Harvard that was founded as a Native school, and that Native people were taken to be educated, and they're completely flipped now, but that's what they started as, and there's many others like that across this East Coast. And so this is a card showing Wallace Lewis, who's a Narragansett. I mentioned to you that that's my tribal nation, and he was sent to Carlisle Indian School in 1908. He ran away, self-emancipated in 1911. But when you think about this, it's important because a lot of times when people talk about the boarding school system, they talk about only tribal nations west of the Mississippi that were being brought east to these schools. And we wanted you to see that it was happening to tribal nations here, continuing from already a couple hundred years of this forced assimilative practice happening and continuing even into the early 1900s for Narragansett youth. And so,
yeah, just before we get to this, actually, as a part of this, I guess, is maybe it's surprising to have things like boarding schools and adoptions be part of a project like this, or about part of this longer history. But it gets to one of the things that is actually on this sort of like conversation list is how to define slavery and servitude. So one of the many joys of collaboration is just being open to expanded definitions and expanded understandings of how Native communities have experienced this history. And I think sometimes in the field of slavery studies, we define it narrowly, and it has to be chattel slavery, and it has to be, right? But what does it mean when we think about stealing and loss? And how can we tell histories that are incorporative of all these different kinds of stealing and loss? And so in that way, boarding schools do really fit in. And it's not just chattel slavery necessarily. There's a labor component. I think some of these kids felt like they were enslaved because they ran away and protested in different kinds of ways. But that was, one of the things I think that might be most surprising to people who come to this project is that expansive definitions. Indenture, actual chattel slavery, but also different kinds of other kidnapping and stealing as well. So we might transition to the chairs just to sort of discuss some of these questions, and then very soon want to open it up to the audience too. So shall we take a seat? So one of the questions I want to sort of pose and see how you respond, and we can talk about it, is the question of why and how we've missed this history for so long, which is really one of the first questions here. Shouldn't we know more about this now? Why are we only sort of having resources that document this in a way at this time period?
Well, from my perspective, it's part of the total erasure of indigeneity in this space. And so if you don't document the history in a way that's easy for people to find, like, people weren't writing history books about this 100 years ago. They weren't telling this story. If you erase that history, it goes into the whole erasure of indigenous people and indigenous identities in this space, and it reinforces the mythology that we're all gone and that we've all disappeared. Now, you live in a big city here, 10, 12 million people, but yet there are indigenous people that are here, that this was their original homeland, the Lenape peoples. And, I was here in the city, maybe 10 years ago, and there was this gentleman I was presenting, and he was presenting, but he was talking about the forced diaspora from the city, hundreds of years ago, and how they were forced down into like Oklahoma territory where they were pushing all indigenous people, but the Lenape people went down and then came back up and went up into Canada and then came down back through New York. And so just because they're invisible in the urban environment doesn't mean they're not on their homeland and that they're not here. But the strategy has been always to do all of this erasure so that we're not here. And if you don't acknowledge the trauma and atrocities that you've done to a people, then you don't have to ever reconcile that. And so I think that's also part of it. If it is part of the not wanting to tell the story. From an indigenous perspective, who are not the people that necessarily have the right to the voice, I think it's just a painful history. I mean, our history is just layered upon layer of painful history that we're still living as we live in our colonized space, and that we're forced to still, follow rules that are not our rules and cultural norms that are not our norms that are still being enforced.
Thanks for that. And do you want to just touch briefly to follow up on that about the way in which the records themselves have been part of that erasure? So I think part of what you're saying is like, and maybe how I'd phrase is that like as in wider American culture, we don't have a lot of appetite maybe for acknowledging this history in certain kinds of ways. It's hard history. It's hard to recognize the way in which, our treatment of indigenous peoples, we slot it into dispossession, but to add in enslavement is maybe a double layer that is a bridge too far. But the documents themselves are also part of the problem, right? And how historians have interpreted them. I want to say a little more about racial erasure in the documents, just very briefly, too.
Yeah, so I mentioned it a little bit earlier too, that when you dispossess someone of their name, their own name, you're erasing them. When you dispossess them of their village, their clan, their community, you're erasing them. When it just says Indian girl or Indian boy, and in some cases just girl or boy, so that you are completely erased from the identity. But when you think about it from looking at, I'll just go with Indian girl or Indian boy, at least you know they're indigenous. But what you don't know is what nation they're from, which means that later it's very difficult for them to claim their identity to their own home community, right? So you dispossess them of that. And in the record, you lost all of your identity completely, name, location of where you're from, the village, your nation, your family connections, who your parents are, who your siblings are, all of that is erased. Very rarely do you see in these records any connection to parents or other family members. And yet, we know that we have, even to this day, very diverse and tight family connections and family lines. And that's a means of complete, not just erasure, but obliteration of family and community.
Yeah, and I think of documents too, or a contrast between documents in the colonial period, even later on too, where there's official colony censuses that only have two categories, white and black. But when you get into the level of other kinds of records, like probate records, like when someone dies and their estate is inventoried and everything they own is written down, that's when you find a lot of evidence of Native Americans in those same spaces that the official colony census completely obliterated, right? So those kinds of erasures too are part of why we've missed these sorts of things.
And it happened a lot on official documents, birth, death, marriage, military service, where they were just switched, just changed along the way. But there's also records of people fighting back against that as well, and saying, it was just, we call it pencil genocide. It's another way to erase you, to take you away, to make you invisible, and obliterate the communities and force the conquest and colonization upon us.
Yeah. Good. So that's all. Well, we have more, but we want to stop here just to allow some Q&A. So thanks for paying attention. But we'd be open to sort of have a conversation and talk if there's any questions or things people want to ask from the audience. And there's microphones around. Please wait till one comes to you so that everybody online and otherwise can hear. Thanks.
Stand up. Well, sure. Judikwa halish takwa don ale shelu adolonege katua chalagi takwa don diji losta nahanski ale dideyo hanski. Hello, my name is Deidre Harris, and my Cherokee name is Yellow Corn. I am an artist and a teacher. I'm so glad that there is some type of a website where we can try to at least look for information, because my third great grandmother, she was enslaved, and this was after they brought her back from one of the boarding schools in Pennsylvania. And I'm trying to find out more information about that. So this might prove to be helpful. Thank you.
Kanupiam, you're welcome. And I just was down in your home territory down in Cherokee, North Carolina.
Hi, thank you so much for your presentation and phenomenal website. When we learned history sort of about the American Revolution, we understood that there were 2 million people here within the 13 colonies and 500,000 were enslaved. Would that not have included the native enslaved, the natives who were enslaved?
Yeah, so it's interesting. The American Revolution, and we should be talking more about this because 1776 is upon us. I think there's two different things I would highlight. The first is back to the official censuses about official sort of counts by colony of slaves, just generically slaves, absolutely involved and included enslaved indigenous people. How do we know? Sort of on-the-ground records, like probate records, but also newspapers, runaway slave ads. All throughout the Revolution, there are enslaved indigenous people running away, self-emancipating. There's this really amazing moment Thomas Jefferson writes in his notes on the state of Virginia. He says, a horrible thing once happened in this country where people enslaved natives. The same year he's writing that, like, indigenous people like 30 miles from Monticello run away, right? So like it's happening and people don't talk about it and people are oblivious to it. So the enslaved population that people always quote absolutely involves enslaved indigenous people. Some of them are multiracial and so get branded just as sort of Negro or whatever else. The other thing I would say though is there's active enslavement during the American Revolution as a part of the push into Cherokee territory and other places as well. And I think that's a really important thing to acknowledge, that enslavement through bounties, through other kinds of mechanisms, leads to captivity. Sometimes there's whole militias that go out sort of seeking women and children in particular, right? There's no accident that that's the case. So it's a mechanism of terror. It's used during the American Revolution. It almost constitutes a separate war in a way on the Western frontier against Native peoples. But yeah, thank you for that question.
Hi there. I'm just wondering what kind of work volunteers do on your behalf.
Well, it depends on what the volunteers bring to the project, but really anyone can be involved in 2 or 3 different ways. The first is there's often people come to us from a particular part of the country with some local knowledge about this history, and we welcome that, so they're willing to sort of do some local kind of researching. We also have materials that have not been transcribed and put into research documents, and then there's also the process of putting that into the database, and we have training for all those different kinds of things as well. Sometimes people come with other kinds of gifts like writing, and so writing the stories or something like that could be utilized as well. Basically, we just have it's such a big history and there's too much to do, and our staff is so small, so we just welcome whatever people can bring. So feel free to reach out if you have interests. Yeah. Thank you.
Thank you. Good evening. 2 things. My paternal grandparents on both sides, my father, his father, I've learned today they were Blackfoot, and he wound up in the Caribbean, which was Dutch Guiana at the time, Suriname today. So that's something interesting that I didn't know. His mother, Native American Shinnecock, and they still have that on the island here in New York City. The question I have, Lorén, when I was looking at the website about the blood, I didn't understand when they put the percentage, like the 3 and the 8, like they have. Can you explain that?
Yeah. So that's a great question. So FYI, that is a federal government construct in order to de-Indianize people. It is something that they kind of created, and how they come up with the number is based off of their own opinion in a lot of ways. So they would say, okay, your mother is Narragansett, let's say, but your dad isn't Narragansett. Maybe he, in their opinion, is black. And then they would say you're half, right? But if that person that was supposedly something else was a generation before, then they would give you a different percentage. but they kind of made it up. The blood quantum, I mean, there's a really great podcast. It's called All My Relations, and they spend like maybe even 3, definitely 2 episodes talking about the construct of blood quantum as a means to detribalize communities. And so it is, that card really blatantly puts it there, and they just make it up. The other thing is, most cases, they're the ones that wrote it down. So that shows up on birth certificates. It shows up on other kinds of documents like enrollment in school, medical records, other kinds of things like that. But one person can be all kinds of different numbers because they made them up as they went along based on their own opinion. If you were a little too light or a little bit too dark, they just sometimes made that was their own opinion and made those assumptions. One of the things that I remember when I was doing the book with Robert Geek on From Slaves to Soldiers, is that not only did someone go into the Revolutionary War as indigenous and come out as colored, but also that their indigeneity of people also changed in regards to how much indigenous they were in the record and things like that. So there's a lot of manipulation whenever there was an opportunity for a record, whether it was a census or not. I mean, it'd be like me standing here and deciding what ethnicity all of you are by a surface look, by the last name that you might have, the clothes that you're wearing, and I would make assumptions all across this room as to people's ethnicities, and I'm pretty sure I'd get a lot of them wrong by doing that. And that was a lot of what was happening. It was just the gatekeeper, whoever that was doing the paperwork. And that still continued right into the 20th century of them putting whatever they wanted on the paperwork. But tribal communities have really been pushing hard and fighting back against that because it's just another mechanism that they're trying to use to detribalize us in the 20th and 21st centuries. Mm-hmm. Right, mulatto, mustee. There's another one. What's the third one? I don't know. Well, I guess colored could fall into that category as well, because what exactly does that mean?
Miyari Dairile Albelisa Perez. Thank you so much for all of the work that you're doing. I have 2 questions. I'm curious about how your team is currently working with, source archives to address and update the use of keywords in their cataloging systems. Are there efforts underway to I love all the work that you're doing on the website. Obviously, it's really inspirational, but I also want to know, is it sort of affecting some of these source institutions and the way that they're thinking about their archives? And then my second question is a little bit more just curious based on my own family history. If you're working with archives and institutions across the Caribbean, South America, and Central America? Thank you.
Yeah, so in a way, it's all we can do at the moment just to kind of get our own verbiage right, and hopefully that becomes a model in some ways, or at least a model for places. I do know there is a vein in the archival world of sort of critically reevaluating this. It takes a little bit to trickle down to some of these older, stodgier institutions, I think. And so I can't speak for all of that, but we're concerned with that and aware, and when it's relevant in conversation, but haven't I don't know even how we would sort of influence the larger picture. On the question of the Caribbean and South and Central America, there's so much opportunity for collaboration here. The vision for this, even though we tilt a little bit New England-centric at the moment, we would love to open this up and to have more robust collaborations. I don't really know how to do that. I think it takes kind of a decentralized model of institutional collaborators in different places who are willing to sort of raise funds and be part of the process. So we would welcome that. We are aware that as we do that, we need to change our entry form to take in a different array of information coming from Spanish or French Catholic situations, right, where you have godparents and other kinds of really detailed notarial records that come out of these contexts. So very interested. and we're thinking about all of that as well. Yeah, thanks.
And back to the first question about changing sort of the lexicon for archival work. I think some of the work that I'm doing within our own very tiny museum in Exeter and the partnerships that we have with a variety of other bigger museums, we've been pushing the envelope on language choice. It's a small push, but a push, and we're starting to see like a little ripple of change in language. Just to give one example, in our collection and archive, we call them belongings because they belong to the people, the community they're from. There was a maker, there was a user, whether there was other people that intercepted it along the way, it still belongs to our community. And so those are kinds of words that are starting to take hold in other places. Even non-native or non-culturally specific institutions are starting to at least introduce the word as another option for object and, artifact, which kind of dispossesses it and makes it this thing over here and not connected to the community. But we have like a long list of words like that we're using. And when we're using them and researchers are coming in, they're starting to get exposed to those words and starting to use them in their daily rounds. And I think it's, as Lynn said, these are old institutions and change in them is very slow. But I think the more that people are exposed to different changes of word choice and vernacular that can be utilized to represent communities in different kinds of ways, the more they'll start to be a change. There's just some words that just don't work, in my opinion, for representing Native culture and community. But I also think there's some Native indigenous archivists out there. I'm not an archivist, although, I throw around archival words and things like that. But I think there's some really great ones out there on the national level. There is a book out there. I can't quite recall the name. It's like tickling the back of my mind. But maybe if you just research indigenous archivists, maybe some of that will come up and you'll find it. Because there are some people on a scholarly level, institutional levels in colleges and universities that are starting to do that work. I'm more one of those just do it kind of person. And so we're doing that work, decolonizing our own museum, because museum structures are a colonial structure to begin with. So, we decolonized our collections management policies, and we're written up in a scholarly article about the work that we were doing. But I think there's a lot of people out there in different pockets doing the work, and then also going beyond just doing an article to doing like the whole book to help people through that process. So
we have time for just one more question. Before I take it, I wanted to say thank you for putting together this amazing presentation and for your work.
You're welcome.
And I wanted to ask everybody, following the program, the room is going to be reset. And so I know that Lynn and Lorén will move into the front. And if you have further questions, please help us out by gathering there and not around the stage so that our staff can reset the room and go home. So here's the final question.
Yes, hi. Thank you for the presentation. I just experienced on my maternal side Native Indian, and they're located from Virginia. And I just experienced a couple of weeks ago on my mother's birth certificate, my grandmother had like 4 different names. And then when I went to the archive, they couldn't identify her. I went to get her birth certificate, and I gave them the name off my mother's birth certificate. They couldn't find it. I paid for it, so it's pending. But then when I went to the clerk office to get my grandparents' marriage license, they had her name as she presented her name on the marriage license, but the ages was different. On the marriage license, it was like they were married 21 years old and 20, but on my mother's birth certificate, it said my grandfather was 26 and she was 22. So, they have erased some archive records.
Yeah, the archives are very difficult because, again, there were sometimes other people doing the writing down for you. There was language barriers sometimes if people were still speaking a good chunk of their time with their indigenous language, their original languages also interferes. And then there's the idea of the quote unquote Indian name versus the Anglo name that they're forced to use. And so some people are in their community only going by their traditional name. And then when they go to a thing, then they're writing down, Mary, John, Joseph, whatever, usually they were biblical names is why I picked those. And that would be what their name is. But then there would be like in a community, a ton of people with the same name. They would have that same biblical name, and it would be multiple generations of that. So it gets really tricky when you're going through the records because sometimes they weren't allowed or the person didn't know how to write down a traditional name that would have probably differentiated, the John James from another John James by having the traditional name. So sometimes it's by the ages that you have to look, sometimes it's by the location where they're at, and sometimes it's just really confusing. And so genealogy is a tough process because a lot of indigenous documentation wasn't done well by the people that were taking the information. So thank you for sharing your story, though.
Can I just tell a quick story too? It's reminded me of a story that someone actually from the Narragansett Nation told me at one point. In the 1970s, they're living on the reservation. They go to a local white doctor for healthcare, and only a few miles from home. And the doctor leaves the room, and she happened to look at the medical record, and the doctor had listed her as a negress, right? Like embracing completely her native identity. And she just sat there thinking like, again, the challenge in recent memory of the same kind of erasure, how much more so throughout this long history as well. So anyway, it has always stayed with me to remind me of that kind of erasure as well. So anyway, thank you so much, everyone. It was lovely to be here. And we're definitely happy to chat, but we'll move it out there. So.